I was standing in the Imperial War Museum in London last week, literally just trying to get out of the rain and kill an hour before meeting a friend for coffee, and I had a complete identity crisis. I'm walking past these exhibits looking at tanks and planes, and my American brain is doing what it always does. I'm nodding along, thinking, yep, look at that good old American steel. Look at us saving the world. Look at that technology we brought over to help the Brits. And then I started reading the placards. I mean, really reading them. And I swear to you, I felt the floor drop out from under me. I've lived in the UK for nearly 2 years now, and I've gotten used to driving on the left and calling fries chips, but nothing prepared me for the absolute dismantling of my World War II historical ego. We grow up in the States with this very specific narrative, right? The narrative is Europe was in trouble, they were fighting with sticks and stones, and then Uncle Sam showed up with the future, with the best tech, the best science, and the best gear. But here is the uncomfortable, fascinating, and honestly mind-blowing truth I've had to accept. We didn't bring the future to Britain. In so many critical ways, we showed up and borrowed it. I'm not talking about small things, I'm talking about the fundamental technologies that defined the 20th century, the stuff we use every single day, the stuff we built our superpower reputation on. I found out that while the US had the manufacturing might, the arsenal of democracy, the actual blueprints for the wildest, most sci-fi tech of the war were usually drawn up by some guy named Nigel in a shed in Birmingham or a drafty university lab in Cambridge. So grab a drink, get comfortable, because we need to deconstruct the American invention myth. I have pulled together the 10 biggest shocks I've had as an expat, digging into this history. We are going deep today into the patents, the politics, and the psychology of why we think we invented everything, and why the British are too polite to correct us. Let's start with the one that literally heats up your leftovers. 1. The cavity magnetron, or why your microwave is actually British radar. If you ask any American who invented the technology inside your microwave oven, if they know anything about history, they might say Percy Spencer at Raytheon. We have this famous story about him standing in front of a radar set and his chocolate bar melting in his pocket. It's a great story. It's distinctly American accidental genius in a corporate lab. But that story starts in the middle. The actual device that created those waves, the engine of the microwave, that is the cavity magnetron, and its origin is so British it hurts. Here is the context we never learn. In 1940, the war was going badly. Britain was being battered by the Luftwaffe. They had radar. We'll get to that later, but their radar was huge. It required massive towers. You couldn't put it on a plane. You couldn't put it in the nose of a night fighter to hunt German bombers in the dark. To do that, you needed high-power, short-wavelength microwaves, and nobody on Earth knew how to generate them efficiently. Enter John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham. This wasn't a massive, well-funded government project like the Manhattan Project. This was two guys in a lab with a budget that probably wouldn't buy a used Honda Civic today. In February 1940, they built this strange little copper block with holes drilled in it. The cavities. They hooked it up to a vacuum pump, sealed it with wax, literally sealing wax they found in the lab, and turned it on. They were hoping for maybe a few watts of power. The thing put out nearly 500 watts. It was so powerful, it blew their light bulbs. They had accidentally created the most powerful microwave generator the world had ever seen. It was a quantum leap. It wasn't just an improvement. It was like inventing the iPhone when everyone else was using 2 tin cans and a string. Now here is where the special relationship gets real. Britain had the invention, but they didn't have the factories to mass produce it because, well, they were being bombed every night. So in the fall of 1940, a man named Henry Tizard flew to Washington with a black metal box. This is known as the Tizard Mission. I want you to picture this. A British official walks into a meeting with US military brass, opens a black box, and pulls out this palm-sized copper disc. He basically says, this is the cavity magnetron. It's about 1,000 times more powerful than the best thing you Americans have right now. You can have it, just please help us make them. The Americans were stunned. One US historian later called that black box the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. It allowed the Allies to shrink radar down to fit into planes and ships. It hunted U-boats, it guided bombers, it won the Battle of the Atlantic. So why do we think it's American? because American factories built millions of them. We took the British blueprint, applied American mass production, and flooded the war with it. But every time you heat up a burrito, you are using the direct descendant of a gadget built by two guys in Birmingham who just wanted to stop German bombers from blowing up their neighborhood. 2. The jet engine, the Whittle tragedy. Okay, this one makes me genuinely emotional. If you go to the Smithsonian in DC, you see the Bell P-59 Aerocomet, America's first jet. You look at it and think, yeah, American aerospace dominance starts here. The reality is that the American engine in that plane was a copy, a direct licensed copy of a British engine. The story of Frank Whittle is the ultimate example of the British underdog genius archetype, and it's a tragedy of bureaucracy. Frank Whittle was an RAF officer who filed a patent for a turbojet engine in 1930. Let that sink in. 1930. Most planes were made of wood and fabric, and this guy was designing an engine that sucked in air, compressed it, ignited it, and blasted it out the back. But here is the difference between the US and the UK cultural mindset, and it's a big theme we're going to explore. In the US, if you have a crazy idea that might change the world, venture capitalists or the military usually throw money at it just in case. In 1930s Britain, the Air Ministry looked at Whittle's design and said, "That's very interesting, but it's mathematically impossible. Also, it's too loud." Denied. Whittle let his patent lapse because he couldn't afford the £5 renewal fee. £5. He literally couldn't keep the patent on the jet engine because he was broke. Despite the government ignoring him, he kept working. By 1937, he had a prototype running. It was terrifying. It would spin out of control and threaten to explode, and everyone would run for cover. But it worked. By 1941, the Glotter E.28/39, the first Allied jet flew. Now, here's the American assumption part. In 1941, General Hap Arnold from the US Army Air Forces visited the UK. The British, desperate for allies and production capacity, showed him the Whittle engine. Arnold was reportedly gobsmacked. He realized the US was years behind. So what happened? The British, again, handed it over. They flew a Whittle engine, wrapped in blankets, to the US in the bomb bay of a Liberator bomber. They gave it to General Electric. GE took it apart, reverse engineered it, and built the engines for the American jets. The reason we think of jets as American is that after the war, the US aerospace industry exploded, no pun intended, with money and speed, leaving the bankrupt British industry behind. But the DNA of every jet engine today, from the one on your Boeing 737 to the F-35, traces back to Frank Whittle's £5 patent that he couldn't afford to renew. 3. Colossus, the computer that didn't exist. We all know the movie The Imitation Game, right? Benedict Cumberbatch plays Alan Turing. They break the Enigma code and everyone cheers. That movie cemented the idea that British code breaking was crucial. But there is a massive piece of hardware that was left out of the popular narrative for decades, which led Americans to believe we invented the digital computer. Ask an American computer science student, what was the first electronic, digital, programmable computer? They will almost certainly say ENIAC. It was built in Pennsylvania and announced in 1946. It took up a whole room. It's in all the textbooks. But ENIAC wasn't the first. Colossus was. Colossus was built by a British telephone engineer named Tommy Flowers. I love that name. It sounds like a character from a Dickens novel. He designed it to break the Lorenz cipher, which was even more complex than Enigma. This was the code Hitler used to talk to his generals. Colossus was up and running at Bletchley Park in early 1944. It used vacuum tubes, thousands of them. It was digital. It was programmable. It was reading 5,000 characters per second just days before D-Day, giving Eisenhower the confirmation that the Germans were fooled by the invasion plans. So why does ENIAC get the glory? Why does America get the credit for the computer age? Secrecy. Cold, hard, paranoid secrecy. After the war, Winston Churchill ordered that all the Colossus machines be smashed into pieces. The blueprints were burned. The engineers were sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act. They couldn't tell their wives what they had done. Tommy Flowers went back to his job at the post office, designing telephone exchanges. When the Americans unveiled ENIAC with a massive press conference and newsreels, the British team had to sit there and watch, grinding their teeth, knowing they had beaten them to it by 2 years, but unable to say a word. It wasn't until the 1970s that the existence of Colossus was declassified. By then, the narrative was set. America invented the computer. But the reality is, the digital age was born in Bletchley Park and then deliberately murdered to keep a secret. 4. The Bailey Bridge, the IKEA of war. Let's move away from high-tech electronics to something heavy, metal, and incredibly practical. If you watch old Deutsche Welle footage, especially of the US Army moving across France and Germany, you see them crossing rivers on these truss bridges. They look like giant Meccano sets or erector sets. I always assumed this was the US Army Corps of Engineers at work. It just feels American, right? Modular, standardized, mass-produced steel. It fits our industrial aesthetic perfectly. Nope, that is the Bailey Bridge, designed by a British civil servant named Donald Bailey, who sketched it on the back of an envelope, literally while driving back from a meeting in 1940. The genius of the Bailey Bridge wasn't just that it was strong enough to hold a tank, it was that it was designed to be soldier-proof. You didn't need a crane to build it. You didn't need special tools. The parts were light enough to be carried by 6 men. You pushed it across the river from one side. It was basically the world's highest stakes IKEA furniture. Here is the data point that blew my mind. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American Supreme Commander, the future US President, listed the Bailey Bridge as one of the 3 most important pieces of equipment in the war, alongside radar and the heavy bomber. The US Army loved this British invention so much they adopted it instantly. They manufactured thousands of miles of it, but because the soldiers building them were often American GIs and the newsreels showed American tanks crossing them, the Britishness of the design just evaporated in the public consciousness. We appropriated the bridge because it worked. 5. Hobart's funnies, the tanks we laughed at, then needed. This is my favourite topic because it involves a guy named Percy Hobart, who was eccentric even by British standards. Leading up to D-Day, everyone knew the Atlantic Wall was going to be a nightmare. Mines, bunkers, soft sand, sea walls. The standard American approach was send in the Marines, send in the bombers, and use standard Sherman tanks. The British approach was let's turn the tanks into a circus act. Major General Percy Hobart designed a series of specialized tanks that the troops called Hobart's funnies. There was the Crab, a tank with a spinning chain flail on the front to beat the ground and explode mines. There was the Crocodile, a tank that dragged a trailer of fuel and shot a flamethrower. There was the Duplex Drive, DD, a tank with a canvas screen that could float and swim. There was the Bobbin, a tank that unrolled a giant carpet over the sand so other vehicles wouldn't sink. Now here is the conflict. The British offered these funnies to the American generals. The Americans largely said, no thanks, they look ridiculous. We'll stick to our standard kit. They did accept a few of the swimming tanks, but mostly rejected the rest. On D-Day, on the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, Sword, these weird tanks were clearing minefields and cracking bunkers open. They saved countless lives. On Omaha Beach, the American beach, the lack of these specialized tanks was a disaster. The standard tanks sank or got pinned down. The infantry had to do the job of clearing mines with their bodies. It's a grim lesson, but it overturns the myth that American equipment was always superior. In this case, British eccentricity and shed engineering, welding chains to a tank drum, was functionally superior to standard American doctrine. We laughed at the funny tanks and then we paid the price for not using them. 6. Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. When we think of D-Day, we think of the boats. We think of the men storming the beaches. But as an American who grew up with the logistics-heavy view of the war, I always assumed the fuel supply chain was an American marvel. We are the country of oil, right? But then I learnt about Pluto. The problem, you land thousands of trucks and tanks in France. How do you fuel them? You can't just ferry jerry cans forever. You need a pipeline. But you can't build a pipeline across the English Channel with U-boats everywhere. The British solution was so audacious, it sounds like a lie. They decided to manufacture a flexible pipeline, like a giant garden hose, wind it onto massive floating spools called conundrums, and unspool it across the floor of the ocean. Here is the wait what detail. They didn't have the machinery to make this specific type of high-pressure flexible pipe. So who did they call? The companies that made undersea telegraph cables? Yes, but they also needed lead sheathing, so they called, wait for it, ice cream manufacturers. They realized that the machinery used to make ice cream bars could be adapted to extrude lead sheathing for the pipes. So you have a pipeline designed by British engineers, manufactured in part by ice cream factories, unspooled by the Royal Navy, pumping millions of gallons of fuel to American General Patton's tanks as they raced toward Germany. It's the kind of logistical miracle we Americans usually claim, but this one was 100% British ingenuity. 7. The proximity fuse, the Tizard gift, part 2. This is a technical one, but stick with me because it changed the course of the war in the Pacific, which Americans view as our theater. The proximity fuse, or VT fuse, is a tiny radar set that fits inside the nose of an artillery shell. Before this, if you shot at a plane, you had to set a timer on the shell or hope for a direct hit. It was incredibly hard. The proximity fuse sensed when it was near the plane and exploded automatically. It increased the kill rate by like 500%. Most American history books celebrate this as a triumph of the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, at Johns Hopkins. And it was. The Americans miniaturized it and ruggedized it so it wouldn't break when fired from a gun. But the core concept, the circuit designs, the initial research, that came out of that same Tizard mission black box I mentioned earlier. British researchers at Pi Limited and other labs had done the groundwork, but once again, didn't have the resources to perfect it while being bombed. When the US Navy started shooting down Japanese kamikaze planes in 1944 and 1945 with uncanny accuracy, they were using American shells fired from American ships, triggered by a British concept that was handed over for free in 1940. It's another example of the concept versus execution divide that defines the war. 8. Chaff, or window. Electronic warfare sounds like a modern thing. Jamming signals, stealth tech. I assumed this was Cold War stuff or maybe late war American tech. But the British were dropping window, their code name for chaff, in 1943. The concept is hilariously simple. Radar works by bouncing radio waves off metal objects. So if you throw millions of thin strips of aluminum foil out of your plane, the enemy radar screen goes white. It looks like a blizzard. They can't see the bombers. The British scientist Joan Curran came up with the idea. They tested it, it worked perfectly. But here is the psychological twist. The British were so terrified that the Germans would figure it out and use it against them, ruining the British radar advantage we talked about earlier, that they sat on the invention for over a year. Churchill practically had an ulcer worrying about it. They finally used it during the bombing of Hamburg in 1943. The German radar operators were helpless. They were reporting thousands of planes appearing out of nowhere. It saved hundreds of Allied bomber crews. Americans later used chaff extensively. We use it today. But the origin isn't a high-tech US lab. It was Joan Curran cutting up strips of foil and dropping them out of a plane to see what happened on the scope. 9. The Mulberry harbors. This ties back to D-Day. The Germans knew we had to capture a port, like Cherbourg or Calais, to offload supplies, so they fortified the ports heavily. The British solution? If we can't capture a port, we will bring one with us. This is the Mulberry Harbour concept. It sounds insane. Massive concrete caissons, called phoenixes, each 6 stories high, built in secret all over Britain, towed across the channel and sunk to create a breakwater. Then, floating roadways, called whales, that rose and fell with the tide. I always assumed this was American because of the sheer scale. It involved 600,000 tons of concrete. It feels like the Hoover Dam or something the US Army Corps of Engineers would do. But it was a British project from start to finish. Winston Churchill wrote a memo in 1942 demanding piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. When American troops were driving their jeeps off the landing ships and onto these floating steel roadways, they were driving on a British civil engineering masterpiece. The spud pierheads, legs that could jack themselves up from the seafloor, are still considered an engineering marvel today. 10. The earthquake bombs. Barnes-Wallis. Finally, let's talk about bunker busters. In the modern era, the US Air Force is famous for the MOAB, mother of all bombs, and these precision weapons that can penetrate deep underground. We assume we invented the concept of the deep penetration bomb. Enter Barnes-Wallis. He's the guy who invented the bouncing bomb, the dam busters, which is famous here in the UK, but less known in the US. But his other invention, the tall boy and the grand slam, were the original bunker busters. Wallace figured out that if you drop a really, really heavy aerodynamic bomb from very high up, it goes supersonic. When it hits the ground, it doesn't just explode on the surface. It punches into the earth like a bullet into water. It creates an artificial earthquake that shakes the foundations of buildings nearby. He designed these massive 12,000 pounds and 22,000 pounds bombs. The Grand Slam was so big the bombers had to take the doors off the bomb bay to carry it. In 1944 and 1945, these British bombs were destroying V-2 rocket sites and submarine pens that American bombs were bouncing off of. The entire concept of kinetic penetration, using speed and mass to destroy a target underground, is a Barnes-Wallis brainchild. The US military studied his data extensively to build the modern bunker busters we use today. So why did I just spend words dismantling American exceptionalism? It's not to say that America didn't contribute. God, we contributed. Brought the industrial capacity, the manpower, the logistics, and the bravery of millions of soldiers. The war couldn't have been won without the US, but living here has taught me that history is a collaboration. The special relationship wasn't just a political slogan, it was a literal trade. Britain, under the existential threat of annihilation, was forced to be incredibly creative. They had to invent their way out of a corner. They provided the spark, the radar, the jet engine, the computer, the designs. America provided the fuel, the factories, the money, the scale. We tend to look back at Twayuai as the moment America became the world's superpower, and it was. But we often forget that we built that superpower status on a foundation of British innovation that was handed to us often for free, in the spirit of survival. So next time you heat up a burrito in the microwave, or get on a jet plane, or look at a computer, just remember there's a little bit of a British shed in there somewhere, and honestly, it makes the history so much richer. It's not just America saved the world, it's two friends, terrified and determined, figured it out together. And that to me is a much better story.